Hello and welcome to the Examine Life. Gen Z takes on philosophy. I'm your host, Alara, and today I wanted to kind of get into asking some baseline questions about philosophy. And I'm here with Christopher Porot, a resident scholar at Cambridge University, asking him some questions about what is philosophy and what it means to him. Hi, Christoph. Would you mind introducing yourself to the audience?
Sure, of course. Hello, I'm Christophe. I did my undergraduate studies at St. Olaf before proceeding to Oxford University and Harvard University for my postgraduate studies in philosophy. I am currently a scholar in residence with the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism at Cambridge University and a PhD researcher at the Sorbonne in Paris. I've dedicated most of my life to examining the big questions, especially those questions that teeter on religious or spiritual subjects, and I'm deeply engaged with the field. So I'm very honored to be your first guest, and congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you. So I kind of wanted to start off with a question that a lot of people probably have lingering in the back of their minds if they're kind of introducing themselves to philosophy or getting into the topic. And that question is pretty much just what is philosophy to you? Like in your own words, how would you define philosophy?
Yeah, so there's a few tiers to that, the response I could have to that. But the opening understanding is that philosophy is what you do when you don't know what to do. So philosophy operates in the gray zones, as Dan Dennett said. And this means that philosophy is not defined by the style of the craft, as analytic philosophers might say. It's about precision and clarity, or the subject of the craft, as some existentialists might say, it's about life's meaning and life's purpose and us, our ontology, and who we are and what we are. But rather, it's defined by the ambiguity of the questions being addressed. So, philosophy is the activity we undertake when we're dealing with the toughest, most evasive questions we can possibly handle. And that's why some of the philosophical questions, like those in the domain of ethics and religion, remain very vibrant and alive today. And others, once philosophers have figured out a kind of metric or system you could use to implement solutions on a regular basis to these types of questions, have become their own fields, like most of the sciences and psychology and stuff. These are born out of natural philosophy, born out of philosophy of mind. And so philosophy is defined by the level of difficulty associated with the questions being asked and the level of uncertainty we have about how to approach them. So that's pretty much what philosophy is for me. That's the first element of my answer. The second is I think that philosophy is something that belongs to us all. I like one of my mentors, Charles Tollifer, says that we're born philosophers and it's beaten out of us by society, which means that when we're young, we're very curious about the big questions. We're very curious about all those things that are too difficult to answer in the immediate moment. And yet, as we grow older, we're kind of discouraged from thinking in that way. So the anti-philosophical mindset that's so ubiquitous is not a product of our natural disposition. It's something that's socialized into us. It's something that is a result of being discouraged from being philosophical. So I think it's universal. And the very final thing I'll say about philosophy is that there's a great line from Charles Sanders Peirce where he says that just as we say that bodies are in motion and not that motion is in bodies, so too we ought to say that we are in thought and not that thoughts are in us. In other words, thoughts are a kind of home we inhabit. They're a space where we dwell. And what makes the intellectual different from the non-intellectual, so to speak, is merely the ability to tolerate a plurality of different thoughts, to really engage as many thoughts as possible without getting consumed by one singular ideology or perspective that defines and dominates the rest of a person's thinking. So, in other words, I think in a kind of Cartesian way, we're basically thinking beings, and what we think is kind of where we dwell. And philosophers are willing to examine the house where they dwell a little bit more readily than non-philosophers. So that's essentially what I think philosophy is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I kind of really never thought of it as some like thoughts being something that we possess, but more as things that possess us. I found that really interesting. And to follow up on that, I just wanted to ask, that do you have like practical applications to philosophy in your everyday life? Or is it something that you've sort of been able to value as more abstract thinking?
Yeah, so that's a great question because it's an ongoing debate in philosophy almost. John Cottingham, who's one of the world's greatest philosophers of religion, is campaigning for the engaged stance in philosophy, which is to say that a lot of philosophers for a long time have said, like David Hume, these mind games we play, they're kind of meaningless at the end of the day. That we can come up with doubt about causality, but then we're not really doubting causality in our daily lives. Philosophy is not going to affect the pool game or anything else. Uh, but the engaged stance is kind of letting yourself feel what you're discussing, letting yourself be involved in the process of doing philosophy, letting it be open to the possibility to radical transformations in your life. So I think that for me, it's quite clearly preferable that we go with the engaged stance because philosophy in the everyday life we live can affect and shape the way we perceive everything, what we think is important, how we look at the world, how we divide characteristics of peoples up, um, what kinds of ingredients are going into our thinking will ultimately shape how we experience life itself. So I believe in the radical transformative possibility that is inherent in philosophical thinking, that you can stumble upon a thought so powerful and appropriate for your life that it changes the rest of your days. And so, yeah, I believe in a very engaged stance in philosophy. I don't think it should be a detached, uh, emotionally uninvolved activity. I think, given the gravity of the issues we wrestle with in philosophy, it's better to allow yourself to be open to the possibility that some of these thoughts could change you as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think that something that kind of is lacking in just at least the modern world from my perspective as a teenager around other teenagers is that people kind of neglect the idea that you can approach situations in a different way. And I feel like that could be through philosophical thinking. And I feel like people kind of like think that idea is so broad and just like the word philosophical can be overwhelming to people. And I also wanted to follow up with a question that some people could possibly argue that philosophy has lost its relevance in a world
Mhm.
that's so driven by data and science and, you know, inquiring thought in ways that lack kind of your own personal outlook. So I just wanted to know what your take on that was.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, I don't believe in the view from nowhere. So Thomas Nagel wrote a book about this, but the idea that there really is a neutral, objective perspective and that we could erase all the human biases that go into the production of knowledge and facts and truth and so forth. I don't frankly believe that's very likely. I think that it's better if we're open and honest about the fact that we're infusing our perspective with our maximal attempt to be as objective and neutral as possible, aware that that's kind of an inherently impossible task. Because otherwise, it would be kind of God's eye view. It would be literally you're totally detached, you have no involvement, no cultural or personal or idiosyncratic neurobiological features are shaping your imagination and so forth. And that's just not how we operate.
Mm.
But I think that, in fact, the rise of sciences and technology increases the value of philosophy, probably. And it does so for two reasons. The first is there's an attendant philosophy of science, which is very important, examining what the characteristic activities are that enable a sort of process to be considered scientific. So this is stuff like falsification, the ability to falsify the idea. But of course, there's another level of analysis, which is looking at those epistemic tools that are being developed, partially by philosophers, partially by scientists, but it's aiding the scientific process. So Karl Popper was a philosopher who developed falsificationism, which was very helpful for the sciences as a guiding light for how to go about running experiments. You need to run an experiment where your thesis could be falsified, right? Now, there are limitations to these theories as well. So at the next level, when we're looking at, and this is a little bit complicated, but I think it's really important. When we're looking at scientific facts, we have to remember what a fact is. We have this false idea that there's a fact here and a value here. And a value is this kind of intangible ideal that we strive towards, while a fact is something concrete and undeniable. The reality is that facts rely upon epistemic values, so falsificationism being one, coherence, precision, simplicity. When all these epistemic values cohere over the singular subject, we call it a fact. But values as such of the epistemic variety suffer, and this is Hilary Putnam's work, Hilary Putnam being a great Harvard philosopher for many years. Uh, Values of the epistemic sort suffer from their inaccessibility in the same way that values of the moral sort suffer from an inaccessibility. So you can't really critique morality and things outside of the sciences without also critiquing the sciences themselves
Mhm.
structurally and in terms of what enables them to operate, right? So there's that. And then finally, I think that technology increases power, power to do good or bad. And philosophy is incredibly important as an activity that we can develop around the rise of technology in order to determine how we're going to use these technologies, what we can expect from them, what humanity deserves, what are human rights, and all these basic questions so that we don't misuse technology. So I think, in fact, the sciences and technologies are a wonderful addition to humanity, but uh, they can collaborate with philosophical thinking in a very productive way for all parties, I think.
I agree. I think it maybe could be argued that it's more important now. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think your intuition on that's completely correct. That really, the other thing too is we're forgetting that we're part of the equation, the human element. So while we live with this technological bloom and this incredible increase in material well-being in a certain way, uh, almost across the globe, although of course there's many catastrophic events every day, and there's wars and there's all sorts of things that are heartbreaking, but there's an increase in uh, the material conditions that people are accustomed to based on technology development. So like air conditioning in an American household is not even considered a luxury anymore. And I think that basically we forget that we are part of this experience. So we don't rely uniquely on these externalities of our material life. We also rely on our internal wisdom to
Mhm.
guide us in life. And so you're seeing an incredible increase despite this great bloom of technology. There's an incredible increase in depression, in mental health disorders, in people suffering now in ways they didn't suffer as much before. So we have to attend to ourselves as a being of a sort and really examine what we need to live, what we value, and how we should.
In terms of like people who maybe are interested in philosophy but don't know where to start, I wanted to ask a little bit more about your own personal journey with philosophy and kind of what drew you to it initially, and if there were any specific questions or experience that sparked your interest.
That is such a wonderful question. I really appreciate it. For me, my journey really, it didn't begin, it sort of began early in the sense that I was reading Proust and Hemingway and stuff like this when I was quite young. But I was doing it more in search of quotations. I was looking for phrases that made sense of life. I remember I'm going to get to the point, but this is a background story to it. I remember when I went for a year to a very, very violent hockey boarding school because I loved ice hockey, but I didn't realize how violent a sport it was in Canada. And I came home from boarding school and I was walking with my dad through some berry fields. And he was articulating through Proust and others thoughts that were making a lot of sense of what I was going through emotionally at that time. And I thought my dad had to be some kind of a genius to know all these things, without realizing that there is a great reserve of human insight that's available to us almost universally at this point with the internet. Um, and that can shed a lot of light on those very difficult elements of our existence. And so that was an initial spark, but I still was more focused on hockey and everything else. And so I went to college with the intention of becoming a medical practitioner, with the intention of becoming some kind of radiologist or something like this. And then my mother passed away. And after my mother passed away and my shoulder was injured, so I played less ice hockey even at the club level. I didn't know what to do, really. I didn't know who to talk to. The questions that were burning my consciousness, like what is life? What is death? Can there be an afterlife? There was no one to talk to about those except for the philosophy faculty at my school. And they would take me in and we'd have these long conversations. And then people started to encourage me to pick up philosophy as a craft. And I was still reluctant. But it wasn't until I suppose a year or two after my mother's death, having spent all that time conversing with these great philosophers on such powerful issues, that I realized, okay, you know what? I don't mind the idea of dedicating my life to this, a life of the mind. And I tried really hard to do other things in my life. So, I've worked all kinds of jobs here and there, and nothing satisfies me nearly as much as life of the mind. So that's my opening pathway was first, I was exposed to the emotional power of philosophy, the way it can transform our understanding of our own experience. Like Proust said that pain is a telescope through which we see reality more clearly. So when I was hurting, I leaned on philosophy. And then when I was confused with my mother's death and I was hurting as well, I leaned on philosophy again. And I think there's something very important, which is whenever you're trying to decide what to do in life, a- ask yourself, what do you do when nobody's asking you to do anything? What do you get up to all on your own, without pressure from obligations or expectations? Because that's probably a good arena for you to follow. And that's how I got into philosophy coaching too, which is a subsidiary activity of philosophy for me. Um, it's a great idea to follow what you're naturally inclined towards doing because there's where you'll have the most strength to continue doing it, especially if you're passionate about the activity. Passion is an energy resource that's extraordinary. It just refills itself every day. If you rest, the next day you can get right back to the task. And I think that given how much time we spend working, I kind of disagree with this instrumental theory of work, where we work to make money and therefore to enjoy life through the time we have off of work, where we spend the money. And I think that rather, because at least 50% of our life is really working, um, we should enjoy what we do. I think that's very important. And that's just prioritizing enjoying what I do is how I slipped into philosophy.
Wow, thank you. That's actually really interesting to hear about because I feel like philosophy, as you said, like pertains so much to just like the life of an adolescent. Like that's kind of when you were first introduced to those like quotes and such. And I just was thinking like I feel like as a teenager, you have so many big questions that you think are only lingering in your head and thinking like only because you kind of have this sense that only you're going through things,
Mhm.
um, and that no one else really understands as much as you or thinks as much as you, or no one else is asking like what really is life, and just knowing that like there's a resource that's all about thinking about this topic
Mhm.
was so that was what was so interesting to me. And just like when I just first started reading about philosophy, I was like, all of the things that they're talking about and all of the th answers that they're attempting to find are just like things that I think like every day, like what is life? Like what does it mean to
Mhm.
live? What does it mean to die? Just things like that that I feel like are never touched upon maybe in school or just like in everyday conversation because people are expecting like a concrete answer. So I think that it's interesting. And I also think that your personal journey is really interesting because I feel like it might inspire more people who just like don't really know what philosophy is, but know that it relates to them and know that like there's a path for them to take. So I kind of wanted
Yeah,
to finish it off with a question for the people watching, but that maybe you could answer. If you could leave people with one key insight from philosophy, what do you think that would be?
it's a great question. Okay. So if I could leave people with one key insight from philosophy, what would it be? I think it would be, and I'm not sure about this, this is just intuitively what's coming to mind, but it would be the notion that most of what's most foundationally important to us is also invisible to us. So this was in The Little Prince, where it was an Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, a great children's book in the history of French literature with a lot of philosophical meaning for adults. And he says, everything that matters is invisible to the eyes, therefore we must look with the heart. And I think that when you really dig down into understanding purpose, understanding meaning, understanding normativity, understanding values, understanding all the things that are central to the composition of a meaningful life, you realize that almost none of them are material or concrete or visible. So we do have to look at this world with a broader imagination than I think we typically are willing to do in order to understand what will bring us fulfillment. So that would be my main insight. Of course, to understand that insight, and I think it's why I chose it, you'd have to go ahead and study some more philosophy to really understand how all these things are rendered invisible, uh, and how they're not material. But that's just the point. I would want an insight that would encourage people to keep going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, and just like how do you hope people will think differently about philosophy after listening to this conversation, maybe, or just like in the future, especially, people of my generation who just don't understand like maybe what philosophy could mean to them in the future.
Yeah, I think especially for people of your generation, I would say it's important to remember that your worth is not measurable in quantitative analysis. So money or other metrics or prestige or whatever metric you want to use is a limited source of understanding your own worth. That there's pretty much an imperishable source of insight within you through the human mind and imagination and intellect. That there's a great reserve of thoughts already out there floating around in libraries and even with the appropriate use of the internet and everything else. Um, but I would hope that people of your generation really believe that they matter in a foundational way. Their own well-being matters, and not in the sense of what do other people owe me, but what do I owe myself? How can I think in a way that improves my ability to live? And I think if more people dedicate themselves to thinking in ways that improve their ability to live and function in this world, to love and be loved, basically, which I think is the crux of existence, um, then I think it would be a slightly better world. But that's pretty much what I would hope.
Yeah, I agree. I think that like hopefully people will ultimately come to see philosophy as, more of an invitation to live thoughtfully. That's kind of like what I take from it. So, yeah. Thank you so
Exactly
much.
right.
Yeah. Thank you so much for engaging in this conversation today. Um, and thank you to everyone listening to The Examined Life. Gen Z Engages Philosophy.